back to episode 22 of the Bible Connection podcast. So this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. So I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are some of my good friends, John Steinke.
Hello.
Brandon Stooksbury.
Good to be back.
And Taylor Babcock.
Hey there.
So this week, guys, we are discussing the book of Esther, or as Brandon says, Esther. So at the beginning of the book of Esther, Ahasuerus.
Oh, is that how you pronounce him?
Huh?
Yeah, Ahasuerus?
How do you pronounce it?
Ahasuerus.
Ahasuerus. That sounds like a dinosaur. I don't even know how to say that right. The king of Persia, he injures his pride while trying to show off for his friends at his feast. So how does Esther fit into this, and what can we learn about God in these first couple of chapters?
Well, Esther fits into this story because the king of Persia, that's what I'll call him, because he's got another name. He's also Xerxes. If you ever seen the movie, like 300, you know, that weird dude with the gold glitter on his face.
Is that the movie where it goes, "This is Sparta"?
Yeah, that's the movie.
Yes, kicks him in the hole.
So, like, this is Xerxes or Ahasuerus, or just let's call him the king of Persia, so we're not being confusing. He kind of gets his feelings hurt. You know, his pride is injured. He's throwing this party. He's been drinking with his friends. It's supposed to go on for 180 days, and he wants his pretty wife to come out and dance for him. And she's like, "No, I'm the queen. I'm not gonna embarrass myself." And then he's like really upset because he's like, now everybody in Persia is going to think that wives don't have to listen to their husband. So he basically like concocts this law. It says like all wives in Persia have to listen to their husbands. And his advisors give him this idea to throw on a beauty pageant and try to find a new wife that's even prettier. It's really petty. It's really immature. It just shows just like...
That's what happens when you go drinking for 180 days.
Yeah, it just shows like
it has effects.
how he's not a good figure. And in exile, they do not have a wise king leading over them. But this young woman named Esther, whose parents have died, and she's being raised by this elderly man named Mordecai, she is able to, go into the king and become his queen and become the most beautiful queen that was known in the land of Persia. And so it's an interesting way that like this horrible person, this horrible king making these really horrible decisions, how God is using his ineptitudes, his failures, to bring in this person into his court and give her a place. If you remember, we talked about Nehemiah, how Nehemiah was the cupbearer of the king, and they gave him special privilege to talk to the king. That story hasn't happened yet, but I think it's a good example of what it would have been like in Persia to have access to these kings, because these kings, there's tons of murder and betrayal and assassinations and their coups, they're overthrowing their throne. And so the fact that the beginning of this story of Esther has Esther being placed right into his palace as the queen, it shows how God is placing his people in specific circumstances for his glory.
Yeah, and something else I'd like to add here is that we should not read Esther. I said it right.
You said it perfect.
Okay,
That was good,
okay. Yeah, Allison chastised me the other night for saying Esther. But we shouldn't read this with our modern ideas of what purity is, what our modern ethics into this. We have to remember these characters, these Jewish characters that we see here are still in exile. The decree to go back home has already happened. They have chosen to stay in exile, and when we should not look down on them for that. Jeremiah's call to the exiles to seek for the goodness of the city and build houses, have families. That we should remember that, but we shouldn't come to this and say, "Oh, well, Esther, this was sinful here. We should, she's a bad person. She's a bad character, obviously, because of what's going on here." No, we should not think that. God puts all of us in different situations, right? And this is a wicked king. This is a wicked kingdom. But the Lord is seeking to his people are to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over it, right? So there are some people going back to Israel, but yet some of God's people are still going out, right, and taking dominion over the world, right? And so as we look at this, we were talking before we started, I couldn't help but think about difficult situations that I mean, if we would just open our eyes and think about what's going on in the world around us. I mean, sex slavery is absolutely rampant. I mean, we don't even have to think about in different countries. It happens in our own state. It probably happens in our own city, right? And the boys and girls that are put into these situations are horrific situations. But God is still calling people out of those situations. And where does that begin in those situations? What do you do when you find yourself in that situation? You know what I'm saying? God calls Esther's out of those situations. So we should not look down on Esther. We should not look down on Mordecai for some of the things that he's going to do. We should read the story as a story, right? First and foremost. So
I do want to make a quick mention that Esther's Jewish name is Hadassah. Esther is her Persian name, and by which the book is titled after, and which you really read that. You look in the book of Daniel, you kind of say the same thing with Azariah versus Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I forget the different Hebrew names, but they have double names, but Hadassah is one of those. But what can we learn about God in these chapters? And early on, you can see that, for one, God is not mentioned ever in the book of Esther, or at least by name, but you can see his work. And early on in the first couple of chapters, a Jewish girl becomes queen of Persia. Think about the likeliness of that. And you can see how God is putting things into play to bring about his promise for his people. So thematically, you can see that God upholds his promises. And even when God appears absent, he is present.
One more thing I wanted to mention before we moved on. I started talking about like Persia, and you mentioned Persia too. It's kind of difficult to keep these stories straight with other books of the Bible. We've recently been reading Ezra and Nehemiah. We haven't yet gotten to Daniel. And so just a quick little timeline for you. We emphasized in Ezra and Nehemiah that there were 3 waves of exiles, those under Zerubbabel, those under Ezra, and those under Nehemiah. Esther takes place after Zerubbabel, after they've gone back to Jerusalem and they've rebuilt the temple, but before Ezra and Nehemiah are reteaching the law in Jerusalem. So she is kind of in the middle of that, what was once one story of Ezra and Nehemiah taking place. This is after Daniel. Daniel was with Babylon. So I'm just trying to place some of those in order for you because, we have it here in the middle of our Old Testament, whereas this is not the order that the original Old Testament would have been structured in. And this is, chronologically one of the last stories that was written in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and that's massively, if you don't hear much of anything else we say tonight, as far as understanding the flow of how the scriptures originally were intended, what you just said is massively important.
So like, a kind of a side question for you guys. We speak as though, this podcast, our goal is to help people read their Bibles, right?
Yeah.
So in you just mentioned placing Esther in the timeline. What are some of your guys' recommendations on how to keep the timeline straight? Or as we're going through reading in our Bible reading plan, how to not be confused? Because, like, how am I supposed to know that Esther is supposed to be, like, kind of pictured in between, Ezra and Nehemiah?
Well, first of all, can I say one thing before you get into resources? It's important to know that the chronological order structuring of our English Bibles is not inspired, right? So they have been placed there. It's tradition that we have the books in the Bible that we have, right? To say that they can be read in a different order or should be in a different order puts no that has no bearing on biblical infallibility or inerrancy, right? So just remember, our canonical orders that we have in our Bible are not inspired. Very important.
There are some merits to the order that is in right now, but there are definitely downsides. I think one of the downsides is the difficulty of seeing a continual story through Scripture when it's not placed, in an order. Like when you jump from Esther to Job, come on, that's going to be a huge jump in chronology, and it's going to be a little disorienting if you don't know where you're at. So some resources that are good for you. I always recommend a good study Bible. The ESV Study Bible is my favorite. I read it, and it talks about the author and the date, and it'll compare things. Much more simpler and cheaper. Go to the internet, print off a page of the chronology of like what order the books of the Bible were written in or occurred in. And
just a chart.
If you're struggling to find a chart like that, I know that Scott Hood would love to give you one. He showed me before. He's got tons of graphics that he's got access to right now that he's willing to share with the church. So that's a great way to start if you're trying to make sure you know what order the books are occurring in.
If you print off a chart and it has more than 66 books, it's probably not a good chart.
Yeah.
So it's not to say any chart out there, but yeah, do a little bit of research on that. And I do want to make mention that the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, the Ketuvim, the Law, the Prophets, and the Writings also didn't have all of the books in chronological order either. But Esther was one of the books that was kept with the writings. So when you come across that, you'll notice that Esther is a part of those. And actually, when they're debating this back with the 1500s, Martin Luther actually didn't even think that Esther, because God's name wasn't mentioned, should not be part of the canon. But it obviously is, and you can see that Esther was kept with the scrolls of the writings with the rest of the canonical books that we recognize as that portion of the Torah. I mean, of the Tanakh.
Yeah, dangerous with the side questions. If you start getting us to talk about history, we're gonna go off a big tangent.
They should have heard the previous conversation before we pressed record.
Yeah.
So I want to do another side question because it's kind of what we talked about. Maybe there's no merit to it, but we kind of mentioned this. Instead of asking what can we learn about God in the first couple of chapters, what happens if we ask the question, what can we learn about man in these first couple of chapters?
I think it's Brandon that kind of made that as a really good quip, when we were discussing the questions beforehand. And I think he was emphasizing just what we can see about the sinfulness and the fallenness of the Persian king. His ego, being, something that fuels these ridiculous laws, and him spurning his wife and starting this whole tragedy. But I think that you should ask about God and his relationship to man too, because in the midst of his sinful decisions and selfishness, God is orchestrating things to his glory and for our good.
Yeah, and something that I would trail, what I was getting with that question is a Romans 1 top understanding of what's going on. If you remove the knowledge of God, right, you have, if the knowledge of the true God Yahweh, right, is taken away, or Paul would use the term suppressed, right? Everyone who is able to see and make perception sees through God's creation that there is a God, right, and that he judges ungodliness and wickedness, right? Mm-hmm. We see that Paul says in Romans 1:18, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and all unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." So the truth is being suppressed. The knowledge of Yahweh is pushed away. What happens when that takes place? "For what can be known about God is shown to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have clearly been perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man, birds and animals and creeping things." We could keep going, but
I can't wait to get to Romans. Oh, so good. All right, rolling to the next one. So the book of Esther centers around two sets of characters. So there is Esther and the king, but there are also two men, and they're named Haman and Mordecai. Who are these two men, and how do they interact with the king of Persia?
Mordecai is an older man that was raising Esther since her parents had died. He was there with the first wave of exiles taken away from Babylon, and so we should see him as a man who's been through the suffering and the punishment of exile. He's about 70 years old, and this is about 70 years into the exile that was promised for the people, and he has faced the full brunt in his lifetime of this punishment of being removed from his land, and yet we see him acting faithfully and trusting in God in some, and we can see that implicitly in the way he's behaving. Firstly, there's this king of Persia. They get assassinated all the time. What's that his business? Well, when he overhears that the two guards are about to assassinate the king, he uses his opportunity to tell Esther to warn the king, and he's not immediately rewarded for that. He does it. It's not a
The king actually forgets completely.
Yeah. If you're ever in a situation where you have overhear an assassination attempt, it's a pretty dangerous thing to start going and talking about it. And so Mordecai there, and then in another situation where he talks to Esther and warns her that this may be why you're queen, is that you're here to save your people, which happens later in the text. Mordecai is an example of a man who is being faithful where he is at. Outside of the land, he's being faithful. Whereas Haman is an example of a man who is seeking personal gain. No matter how he has to manipulate the king, he just wants it to be about himself. He wants praises for himself, and they oppose each other in that Haman is a descendant of Agag, which is a tribe of Canaanites that Saul failed to kill all the way back in Samuel, and Mordecai is a descendant of Saul's father. And when Samuel, the prophet, had to step in and kill the leaders of this tribe where Saul failed, this line, now all the way down in exile, you have this Canaanite that's being exalted above the Jewish people and trying to force Mordecai to bow to him. And so this relationship between these two men, I think, is the centerpiece of this story. Mm-hmm. Esther is a faithful young woman who God is using in order to bring about the circumstances that rescue Mordecai and rescue all the people. But I think we should pay attention to Mordecai here, and he should remind you of some people that you might have read already in the Bible. I would think back to Joseph. I'd think back to Daniel. Joseph and Daniel, they're both examples of men who are at their lowest point, taken out of their land under a foreign wicked king, whether the Pharaoh of Egypt or the king of Babylon, and they're completely forgotten until the Lord uses a sleepless night with the king to remember them and bring them up, and eventually they're set as second in command of the entire kingdom. And that also describes Mordecai. So there's a whole lot to talk about with this. I think that the drama of the story and the structure of the story is pitting these two men against each other.
And maybe reading between the lines here, why is it that I think why Mordecai is not bowing to Haman? I think there may be multiple reasons. Obviously, the history, with Agag, and obviously the two men were probably well aware of that, so there would have been some tension there. But if you're reading the text, it almost seems like Mordecai discovers this plot, and it says there are two men that are mentioned, Bigthan and Teresh, and they're plotting against the king. But then right after this is where Mordecai refuses to bow to Haman. In my opinion, it almost seems like Mordecai knows, maybe in the back channels of hearing what was the plot against the king, Haman may have been the culprit getting these two thugs to try to kill the king. I'm kind of reading in between the lines here, because at the after this, Mordecai doesn't have a problem with people bowing to his authority, right? You know what I'm saying? So I'm not sure that it's just
we don't bow down to false idols kind of.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it may just be, this guy's in authority. Show him respect that his authority, possibly.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think that, either way, when you look at this picture of Mordecai, though, we should see that it's going to cause issues between him and Haman. Haman's pride is enraged by his resistance to bow to him, and he plots to have all of the Jewish people murdered. And something I want to emphasize here, the way he does so, he casts the dice. So in the Hebrew, it says they cast P-U-R. That is that they cast lots or dice. And so this is a picture that's placed throughout the text here at the beginning, and we're going to see again at the end.
This is chapter 3, verse 7.
Yeah. It's a picture that's meant to show you what's going on. And one of the things that was mentioned by Taylor just a second ago is that God's not mentioned in the book of Esther. And so some people have come into the book of Esther and interpreted that to say, well, this book has nothing to do with God. Well, I think that the picture that's being presented here is they're casting dice and they're rolling the dice. these seemingly random events that are occurring, right? How is God using them, and how is God planning them, and how is God present in them as he brings things about? Because what seems to be random in the story is not random in the eyes of God. If you look at Proverbs 16:33, it says, the lots are cast into the lap, but the Lord directs how they land. And the Hebrews, the Jewish people, knew that God is not just in control of, religious things. He's in control of literally everything. He's sovereign overall. And I think that this picture, why emphasize the dice? Well, it sets out that they're not going to be killed that day. Haman now has all the political clout to maybe convince the king, hey, tomorrow, let's go kill the Jews. But instead, Haman, by rolling these dice, it's months and months out, and the Lord is going to use this woman, Esther, that he's put into the king's palace and bring it about in such a way that's going to be turned on its head and become the victory of his people.
And that's something else that, as you were saying that, I started thinking about, when they're doing this, they're saying, we've got 5 or 6 different options here. Let's cast this dice, and whatever. It's almost like a game to these people. But in the Romans 1 context, when you remove yourself, when you suppress the knowledge of God, there are coincidences, right? There are things that are random. There are things that just don't make sense. There is evil. There is evil that is absolutely meaningless. But when you have a Christian worldview, when you have a God that's in control of, as R.C. Sproul says, every molecule, there are no maverick molecules, right? When God is in control of absolutely everything, right? You see the contrast of how, this is a political game to these wicked men, and then at the same time you see in the New Testament who's gonna take Judas's place. We're gonna cast lots. It's not a game. We know God is in control of whatever this lot lands on. That's who we know. That's God's choice, right? So we see 2 worldviews here that are completely at odds with each other. So
yeah, and the book of Esther shows that as much as any, that God's provision, his sovereignty is in every single detail, and it unfolds in a very meaningful and purposeful way that God has laid out. So for anyone who holds to deism, which is where God created the world, step back and let it just ride, and everything, whatever happens, and then God is separate from whatever happens. Reading through the book of Esther says much otherwise, that God is in every detail and he's bringing about everything with a specific purpose. As mentioned earlier, John tapped on, I think, 1 Samuel 15, when Saul was commanded to kill King Agag of the Amalekites. There was specific reason that lineage, which led all the way down to Haman, could have wiped out the entire Jewish population. And they were, God had an understanding of what they are. And obviously we see with Mordecai and Haman that God fulfills what was supposed to be done by Saul with Mordecai in killing Haman. But there is nothing that is outside of God's control, and everything is happening for a very specific purpose.
yeah, and thank you so much for bringing that up, because this was something else that I was wanting to talk about. Is a lot of times we most of us know people who think about, I'm in this situation because of either a choice that I've made in the past, or generations in the past. There was this this thing that's happened, and whatever, and basically I'm just, from now on I'm just going to be nothing and nobody, and I'm never going to amount to anything. What we see here is and this may seem like a hard transition, hard shifting of the gears, but we see this serpent and seed motif being played as it's been playing out from Genesis 3:15 all the way, even to now. We are the seed, as we see in Galatians. But Mordecai is doing what Saul should have done. He's seeing there was a failure here. There was an absolute failure here. I'm going to be faithful, right? I'm going to be faithful, and from a very much Joshua, me and my house will serve the Lord, right? And this, this, there may have been covenantal cursings that have been going on, but now there's going to be the tables have turned, right? So.
And to try to bring that faithfulness back to one of the first points you're making, you're talking about how like God is sovereign over the dice as they're landing, and you're talking about the apostles rolled the dice to see who the next apostle would be after Judas. This isn't an invitation by Christians to just start, like, Lord, am I supposed to take this job or this one? Let me roll some dice. If it's one, it's this. If it's two, it's this. The Lord causes the dice to land, and the Lord knows what is going to happen. That is no emphasis that we are privy to that knowledge. And so when Mordecai is exuding this faithfulness, looking at chapter 4, he says something powerful. When he has this understanding of how the Lord's in control of all things as the dice are cast, he says, "For if you keep silent at this time," speaking to Esther, "relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this." We are to live every opportunity and circumstance in faithful, in faithfulness, walking in that the Lord may be using this as an opportunity for us to serve him, to glorify him, to use us in miraculous ways. And Esther's perspective is this perspective we should take. She echoes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when they're about to be thrown in the fiery furnace. What does she say? It's against the law to go to the king without permission. I'm going to try it. She says in verse 16, "If I perish, I perish." That is the faithful response. God is in control of all things, which means he's also in control of things that don't go your way. This is a text that it really speaks personally to me. I've got a life testimony where a lot of things don't necessarily go my way all the time, but the Lord has been faithful and good in the midst of families being broken, in the midst of chronic health problems, in the midst of spontaneous hospital stays that are confusing, and all of these things that have happened in my life that I've not understood. The Lord has been aware of from the beginning. He's been faithful in throughout the entire circumstance, and he has provided in ways that I could have never seen. And so if there's something that you should take away from the book of Esther, I want you to take away that trust in the Lord's providence. That's a typical theme you'll see in almost any pastor's book that's summarizing Esther for you. The Lord is providing even when you can't see him, even when his name's not mentioned in the text. He's in control over everything.
All right, rolling to the next one. So when Esther, she finally reveals the truth to the king, right? He punishes Haman, but he doesn't cancel the order to kill the Jews. So why is that? Why did he do that? And how did the Jews escape their persecution?
Well, the king can't simply just take away a law. In the Persian context, he can't just say, well, I wrote this law to kill the Jews on this 1 month. That can't happen. But he can write other laws. And so what the king does instead is he says, well, we've got time to fix this. Let's write a law that says all the Jews are allowed to arm themselves and defend themselves, and they're allowed to attack any enemy that they want. And so when the day finally comes, it turns the day that should have been their utter destruction into their victory. The Jews are given time to arm themselves with weapons. They are given time to think about which enemies have been plotting against us, and they, throughout the entire land, not just in Susa, which is the capital of Persia, where most of this drama is taking place, but throughout the entire empire, there are stories of their victories recorded here, where they destroyed their enemies. And so this becomes a salvation for the people of God that is worked through that. And as for Haman, he built these gallows, right, or these wooden beams. Whether he was going to impale Mordecai or hang him is kind of, difficult to interpret, but he was going to put his body 75 feet in the air so that everybody around could see his death. And the irony is that the very gallows he built for himself is what he's hung on. And so in Deuteronomy, we know that we've talked about this before in the podcast. It says, "Cursed is any man who hangs on a tree." And Haman is ultimately cursed for his own sinfulness and plotting against God's people.
And you kind of see an inverse of what David condemns himself. Nathan comes in, gives him a parable about a man who takes a sheep, and David pronounces pronounces a judgment on that man. Well, you kind of see the exact opposite here. Haman is assuming that the king is going to bless him, so he names, it's kind of a health and wealth gospel, but in reverse, right? For somebody else, you know what I mean?
Name it and claim it.
That's right. That's right. For somebody else, and the reverse happens.
Like Balaam.
Yeah, yeah. But going back to reading, the previous question, God isn't mentioned in the book of Esther. Esther, that's true. But as you read these things, salvation for the Jews will arrive somewhere else, right? The irony of Haman being hung on his own gallows. This inverse of what happened with Nathan and David. So many things. Also, something I wanted to mention before I didn't get to, but when Mordecai is confronted with the news of the judgment that has come, it says that he puts on sackcloth and ashes, right? And that's forbidden at the entrance where he's at, and we see here this time of lament, right? And in my own life in Christianity, lament is something that we don't think about a lot. We think, this horrible thing has happened. I need to make a decision right now. Well, you see sackcloth and ashes, times of lament happening, and it's a real time that I myself need to take into consideration. When these things happen, God has built us to that we need this time of processing. We should not be making rash decisions. We should be thinking through what the next angle, where we need to go, what we need to say, what kind of provisions need to be made. You know what I'm saying? So lament is very important for this, and we see that theme running through Scripture, and we also see Mordecai embodying that principle very well in the story. So,
all right, finishing us off. I know we've gone a little long, but to celebrate their victory over their enemies, Esther and Mordecai established the holiday of Purim. So what is Purim?
If you look at the very end of Esther, it actually gives an explanation for where this festival comes from. And they look at the dice that Haman was rolling in order to figure out the destruction for the Jews. And it says in verse 26 of chapter 9, therefore they called these days Purim, after the term pur, which is the Jewish term for casting lots, rolling dice. And so thematically, it's not just something I'm pulling out of Proverbs here when I say we should be looking at how God causes the dice to land. This is the theme of Esther. It's chiastically, if you remember that word chiasms, I haven't busted that out since we talked about Moses and how he structured the Torah. It's chiastically how this book is structured. The end and the beginning are paralleling or mirroring each other to draw your attention to God's hand at work in the middle of the text. And so at the beginning and at the end, you see, the greatness of the king is emphasized at the beginning of the text, and the greatness of Mordecai in chapter 10. And then you have the banquets for the men and the women. That's contrasted with these banquets of the festival of Purim. And then you have Haman being elevated in chapter 3, and that's contrasted to Mordecai being elevated in chapter 8. And all of this is pointing between these two feasts that Esther has for the king. Remember, there's two banquets. Why two banquets? She hosts one banquet, and Haman believes it's his ultimate glory. He goes home and brags about this banquet that the queen brings him to. All the while, we, from the advantage of the reading position, know he is in for it. And then at the second banquet, where he's ultimately brought down to his destruction, and right in the middle, the Lord has the king tossing and turning in the middle of the night. He can't sleep, and he has the truth read to him from a scroll. The Lord is actively at the hand of this entire story. And so this festival of Purim is supposed to be a reminder to the people of God throughout exile, back in Jerusalem, throughout the entire land, never to be neglected. Remember God's hand in your lives. The faithfulness that Mordecai says, if Esther, if you're not the way that God's going to save us, he's going to save us. He's going to be faithful. And so that's really the heart and soul of the festival.
Yeah, and we talked about this before, but Purim has become a debauched, and modern celebrations of it. You basically
There's a prom king now, and you get drunk and have drinking parties.
get drunk and you burn an effigy of
Haman.
But what I want to, the last thing I want to mention here is that Mordecai, we made some connections with Joseph, right? He's in prison. The cupbearer and the baker come. He tells them, what's going to happen to them. He's forgotten, right, in prison, right? Mordecai delivers the king, is forgotten, right? The parallel is there. But another parallel that I would like to bring out is through these afflictions and difficult times. This isn't a prosperity gospel, what I'm about to say, but at the same time, we should take into mind what happens and what Mordecai does, right? So Joseph is put in second command in Egypt, right? And he doesn't refuse that, right? A lot of times we think, church, state, we should keep them separate, which I think is a horrible understanding of the Constitution. But that being said, that's for another matter. We should not be afraid of politics. We should be leading the charge in politics. We should be leading the charge in music. We should be leading the charge in art. We should be leading the charge in all aspects of life. I am a Kuyperian. Abraham Kuyper once said, there is not one aspect of all creation, of all of life, where Jesus Christ doesn't take hold and say, mine, mine. And what does Mordecai do here in the chapter 10, which is only 3 verses? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude and his brothers, and sought for the welfare of the people and spoke to all his people. And we see here that before this, I can't remember the verse, but it's in chapter 9. And what all happened with the Jews? Even people in Persia became Jews because they saw the power of God, right? Mordecai enters into politics, right, and becomes and does great things, right? We should enter into politics, music, art, all of these things. We shouldn't stay away from that. We should be faithful, right, in these aspects. We should not be afraid of that, and we should reject a type of Christianity, a thinking that there are, I'll just say it, 2 kingdoms. That there's a secular kingdom and there's a spiritual kingdom, right? Right. No, we should reject that. Right. We should see there are spheres God has given us. There's the sphere of the home or the family. There's the sphere of the government, and there's the sphere of the church. And God is sovereign over all 3 spheres, and the spheres do overlap. This is Kuyperianism in a nutshell. But we should be faithful where God puts us and where God is leading us in all aspects of life. Right. So.
Absolutely. And every bit of that, God is working through that. And I think as we read, or as a reader of the text, reading through Joseph and seeing how God appointed him to that position, and God was the one that put him there. Yep. As we read Mordecai.
Nehemiah, the cupbearer.
Yeah. From this chiastic structure is the center of it. God is the one doing that. So whatever avenue in life, whether that's politics, art, whatever piece of culture that is, God can put you wherever it is if it's according to his will and his plan. And I think as readers of the text, we need to see that. But as doers of the text, we need to live that out.
Yep. I know that we're way over time, but one last thing I'd like to point out. Jesus says, you read the scriptures and you think that in them you have eternal life, but it is they that bear witness about me. And on the road to Emmaus, he teaches the disciples how the Moses and the prophets, how it all was concerning him. And I don't want us to miss that Christ is here. In this text that doesn't mention the name of God once, that isn't quoted in the New Testament, Christ is still is still shining through in the book of Esther, because we looked at Joseph and how he was brought low and how he was raised up to be put in second command over all of Egypt. And we looked at Mordecai, how he was brought low and God raised him up to be second command of Persia. We said the same about Daniel. Christ was also, for the no fault of his own, was brought out of the camp of Israel, exiled to the cross, killed, temporarily forgotten. His disciples left him. God, why have you forsaken me? And he has been raised up at the right hand of the Father, and all nations have been put in subject under him. No, Mordecai is no Christ. Neither is Joseph. Neither is Daniel. Jesus is the superior type of all of these men.
Well, I believe that brings us to a close. I just wanted to let you guys know we really enjoy this podcast. We love producing it. We love just sitting here and getting to talk with each other through Scripture. I mean, I have been so fulfilled in doing this. So, but one of the ways we can improve it is just by getting questions. So just remember, we have an email. It'll be up on the screen, and leave comments on the YouTube. However you think you can get in touch with us, you get in touch with us. And glad to have you back, Brandon.
Good to be back.
This is really fun. So I believe that's it for week 22, and we'll see you on episode 23.